So this is the Building the Decentralized Web panel. I'm Brad. I'm co-founder at Unstoppable Domains. Good to see everybody. And we're going to be discussing how our companies, the companies here, are building and working on the decentralized web. So maybe we should kick it off with everybody just introducing themselves real quick and saying what company they're with and what they're working on.
I'm Alex Kahaya. Nice to meet everybody. Happy to be here with you, Julian and Andrew. I run business development at Orchid Labs. I'm also the host of a new podcast we're launching called Follow the White Rabbit. That is about the intersection of human rights, privacy, technology, and democracy. And we're building right now, we just launched a decentralized VPN back in December that runs on the Orchid token. And we're building essentially a marketplace for bandwidth that is censorship resistant. And hopefully will power an internet free of censorship and surveillance down the road.
Cool. I'll go next. Julien Genestum, the CEO and founder at Unlock. Unlock is a protocol to tokenize memberships. We believe there is no viable decentralization unless we actually decentralize the business models of the web as well. I've been doing this open web thing for way before crypto, actually, for almost 20 years at this point. I've got a bunch of W3C specs under my name, including WebSub, as well as participation in a bunch of social web working groups, which basically try to decentralize the social web in many ways.
So I guess I'll go real quick as well. I'm Brad. I'm co-founder of Unstoppable Domains. We build domains on blockchains, and we build tools for the decentralized web. So super excited. I actually know all of the panelists here from previous conversations, and excited to see everybody all at the same time. Oh, there's Andrew. So we're just doing intros real quick. If you can hear us, you want to do a quick?
Yeah, I heard you fine. I'm not sure why my thing's cut out there, but cool. Yeah, I'm Andrew. I work at textile.io. We're really focused on trying to minimize the onboarding to Web3 technologies and protocols. We work on kind of three different main pieces of technology. One is ThreadDB. It's a peer-to-peer database, but it's pretty novel in the way that it's meant to allow end-to-end encryption for the people that are exchanging data, but the attachment of third-party services to do important roles, perform important roles in the network, like replication, relay, archiving, things like that. We also have what we call the Power Gate, which is bridging the Filecoin and IPFS networks. And then the third piece of the technology is called the Hub, where these different protocols are all kind of available on demand for developers to use a little CLI. Pretty much our KPI is just how easy can we make it for developers to build things, fail fast, and build the next things.
Nice. Awesome. Well, I'm going to attempt to do something that's maybe a little bit different than the way these panels normally go, where we talk a little bit about the why first before we go super deep into all the different things that we're building and all the cool technologies. So let's maybe start with this. What is the decentralized web? Maybe everybody take a quick shot at defining the decentralized web as they understand it.
Maybe I'll start. For me, it's basically a web where there's no gatekeepers, where no matter what, nowhere in between the creator of content and the consumer of content, because this is mostly what this is about, or creator of application and consumer of application, there is someone or some company or some government that can basically decide to shut it down. That's the idea of a peer-to-peer internet in some ways, pushed to the extreme.
I like that.
Yeah, I'd second that, and then just add it's an internet where you control your data, you control your privacy, you have ownership over that, and you know it's a censorship and surveillance resistant web, which we don't have today. I think it's something that we're all working towards.
Yep, I think those are all really good. I'd love to see somebody write sort of the different phases of decentralization that we'll achieve, because I think there's some really cool sort of features that will emerge at the different phases. And you can think of peer-to-peer networks, and then you can think of like a complete reconfiguration of the internet for data ownership and interoperability and all those great things that we're all working for.
And I really like this this concept of pulling out gatekeepers, because it gives us like a clear metric, where you can basically be like, okay, I have this system, and then how many different people can still shut it down, and where are all the different points, and it kind of like allows you to get a little bit quantitative about like where are the potential failures or points of failure in your system. So what motivates you to work on the decentralized web? Why do you care about this? Maybe I'll start with Alex.
Well, I got into this space because of my partner and friend Brian Fox, who is a co-founder at Orchid. For those of you who write software, you'll know what the Bash shell is. He created that. That was one of the first things that he did in his career. But serial entrepreneur, and at the time I was an entrepreneur in residence at his venture technology company here in Santa Barbara called Opus Logica. And I remember seeing on the whiteboard this like network diagram, this thing like right when back in 2017 before they announced the initial funding of the company. And he just sent me a link one day to the announcement of the raise when we were one of the first companies to raise from Andreessen and Sequoia, all these like big VC firms. And I was sitting at my desk reading about what Orchid's mission was, to build a censorship and surveillance-free internet. And that got me really excited. He's the whole reason I got into open source in the first place. I already had that sort of under my belt as far as a passion and something that I really believe in. And, when he launched Orchid, I started digging into what Orchid was all about. And that led me down the rabbit hole to what the decentralized internet is supposed to be and how things are supposed to be. And I really bought into that vision that I think a lot of people in our space buy into. It seemed like a worthy cause for me to try to do my part. And I also noticed that there's a pretty big need in the space for people who can communicate and for people who have my skill set, around business development and making partnerships and things like that. So I thought it could be a good fit. I'm not an engineer. I'm a self-taught software developer. I can write like Rails apps and stuff like that, but I'm not like writing protocol layer, layer one stuff or anything like that. It's kind of over my head.
What about you, Andrew?
Yeah, well, I've always I kind of came to this space really thinking about data, not really thinking about decentralization or blockchains specifically, but then found them as a possible solution to kind of lower the barriers towards a better future. And so, I kind of think about two kinds of data. One is our personal selves, our digital self, and all the data that we put out there into the world. And I think about a future that where that data is treated exactly as it is today, that we go forward and become more and more digital. And that sort of bums me out, thinking about all the opportunity that we lose and all the possibility that we aren't sort of achieving with really becoming a digital humanity. So that's one part of it. And then the other part of it is the non-human data, things like data about our world. I was a biologist in a previous life, and thinking about our discovery of the world around us and capturing that data and where that data should really belong so that generations that exist 1,000 years from now can build on the knowledge that we're creating today. I really think we're living in the data age. We think a lot about the bad things, the plastic age and things like that, but really people are going to look back in 1,000 years as this is the moment when we first started capturing all of humanity's data, and what can we really do with that? And that's what motivates me and gets me really excited.
That's cool. I hear like a pragmatic decentralization theme in sort of that, and I think that's a really important and needed ingredient. What about you, Julian?
I was thinking about this as you guys were answering. Honestly, this goes back to when I was a teenager, and I was actually a board student, and I was looking for a summer job back in France, and I couldn't find any summer job, and I was like, wow, it's annoying because this magic thing that's supposed to be the internet, where everything is, it was like around 99, 2000, supposed to have everything. Why can't I find a summer job there? And so I was bored and basically started to create a job board for students. And one thing led to another, and after, I don't remember exactly, but like 3 or 4 months, not that long, I started to see job offers from McDonald's and posted on my own site that I created kind of as out of boredom. And to me, that was kind of a revelation, like, oh, this thing is magic. This internet thing is magic because it does remove the gatekeepers. It removes kind of the local bank, the local work agency that we have to go through to, first, the local agency that we have to go through to actually find a job, and they would require me wearing a suit. And you can't see here, but I'm not the kind of guy that wears a suit too much. And so it would require me to wear a suit, and then it would require me to write a resume, which like, I've never done that. And so I created that website, and then I was like, oh, but this website is nothing. It's not even a company. It's just a random website with a SQL database and a bunch of bugs. And yet McDonald's, the largest, or what I thought at the time was, and I don't know if this is still the case, but the largest fast food company post job offers on that website. And to me, that was kind of the revelation, like this is the true strength of the web, like removing gatekeepers. And so I did this, and basically since then, that's been my passion. Is like, how can I make it even stronger and make sure that we remove more gatekeepers as much as possible as we go along.
And I'm not going to do this most of the time, but I am going to answer this one real quick if you all don't mind. So I'm non-technical, but I went to school. I even went to grad school briefly for politics, international politics. Spent a lot of time looking at corruption and failed states and all these things. And you basically see that, if you have a pile of oil or diamonds or whatever in your country, that leads to corruption and authoritarianism and all this stuff. And that also leads to information suppression. And all these things are like kind of connected. And then I became a little bit hopeless, was living in DC and was like, all right, I need to get out of this, stop thinking about this stuff, went back to entrepreneurship, eventually moved out to San Francisco, and didn't even see that there was a possible solution to any of this stuff until, Bitcoin first. And then, later, a lot of the more, of the tools that we'll be talking about today. And so I, started with this cynicism that it couldn't be fixed, and then was surprised to find that there actually are, platforms now that can address it. So it's exciting. So what would you say you're most concerned about right now in terms of censorship in the world? I'll start with maybe I'll start with Andrew on this one.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, censorship is an interesting thing for me because, if you put it in the context of the things that motivate me, it actually isn't always the primary focus of what we're working on. I think it is a really important value and possibly a feature of these technologies. But if you put it in the context of what I was saying before about, what's going to happen to our digital selves over the next 50 years, if you think about humanity becoming more and more digital and the opportunity to control or censor people that are living most of their lives in a digital world, that becomes a little, very concerning. And so thinking about ways that what we think is possible today with censorship, thinking about it even getting worse, and how can we get out ahead of that and build technologies that are resistant to what people might do in the future. So really thinking again at those kind of longer term timescales and trying to get out ahead of problems that are still emerging. And so that's the way I think about it. And I just think a lot of other people kind of keep me grounded in thinking about what's happening really in the world. Like, the Human Rights Foundation is a really great one, or the Project Witness, which is trying to disseminate knowledge about genocide. Sorry, they're trying to disseminate knowledge about genocide so nobody can ever forget those events happening in the future. And I think a lot about those kinds of projects to stay focused on this having a lot of value today to fix these problems. But then things that motivate me are getting out ahead of how keeping it from getting worse in the future.
Yeah, and I think that's just really relevant for us now too, as like everyone's digital life has just tripled over the past 3 months. All of a sudden, like the whole world all at once. So it's like it seems like the stakes for digital ownership of data is just increased massively for all of us. So that's just kind of interesting side effect of the times.
Totally.
What about you, Alex?
Andrew, you mentioned a lot of interesting points. Going back to the control over the flow of information for people, especially as the internet continues to expand and more people are sort of siloed. I mean, if you look at China as an example of that, think of all the opportunity that they are not able to access because they're only seeing one version of the internet. And we're seeing this happen. And this is something that came up that I had not even thought about. I can't remember, maybe it was Roger Ver or somebody, I can't remember who brought it up. Maybe a few guests on my podcast brought it up, that this version of the internet that they're seeing that isn't the open internet, it dictates the way, so many facets of their lives, from their economic opportunity, their ability to access the same kind of freedoms that maybe we do. Although, I think we're seeing daily those freedoms eroded in the United States with what's going on. So I worry about that. I worry about the global community, their access to information, their access to an open web, and the opportunity cost there. And there's a lot of different opportunity costs of that. I also worry on the other side of things around education from a consumer standpoint. I think that most people are, I mean, I think we all are, I'm guilty of this too, being very flippant with my data and at least especially before I joined Orchid, my ideas around censorship. I think there needs to be a big education out there around security and the rights that you have online or that you should have. And I think that's the education piece is really important to enabling people to move to a decentralized web, which then creates more demand in that ecosystem and then causes to grow and then supplant, the current closed system. And the last thing that you said, Andrew, that stuck with me, you were talking about that group that you couldn't remember what they did, that they were like trying to spread information about genocide. So I'm Armenian, and I just finished reading a book called The Road to Ararat. I hadn't actually ever connected with my own history as an Armenian until I read that book. And I'm like fourth generation, American Armenian, and that the Turkish government has completely annihilated any memory of that, and will forever deny that it happened. And anybody who says differently, I mean, bad things happen to them in that country to this day. And a decentralized web, hopefully, but I have fear for those kinds of things. Those memories should not be forgotten, and they're important.
Julian, I know we're getting pretty intense here. I appreciate everybody.
Yeah, and obviously these are extremely valid examples, and I don't know that mine is going to be that relevant. But I guess this week is interesting in many ways. And for those looking later in a couple of years, this is the week where there's been a bunch of protests here in the US about the treatment of Black people to make it as bland as possible and not express any opinion here. But generally, I'm not too worried about, and again, in some cases, it's still happening, but I'm too worried about censorship. I'm actually more and more worried about kind of bargaining power by some players, and that could be states, and that could be around obviously censorship, but that can also be social networks and basically what kind of information they propagate, or they let propagate, or they write on the message that they propagate. All of these things are extremely critical, and that also applies to, say, e-commerce, where everybody buys their food or pretty much anything else from one single website. Everybody watches movies from one single platform. In the end, these, I think, create massive bargaining power. I mean, the Porter 5 Forces thing for these platforms or for these players that are actually acting as gatekeepers in some way. And to me, the challenge is like making sure that these gatekeepers have checks and balances, basically, and ideally eventually
100%.
Are run as open shared infrastructure. I don't know if it's common infrastructures or kind of pure socialism or communism in some way, but like the idea that no, they belong to us as much as we belong to them in some way. Like the social network is a good example of this. Like no social network is worth anything without anyone on there, and so it's kind of weird that they're extracting so much value from us and actually giving little or less and less value back to us in some ways. And value is not just obviously money; it's services that they're actually making us, providing for us.
Yeah. Well, to your point though about social media, if you look at what just happened with Twitter and the censorship of Trump's tweet, although I wouldn't argue the first one didn't get taken down, right? It was just a fact check. I wouldn't call that censorship, but they do have a responsibility, and one of my biggest fears actually that I didn't bring up, Brad, is about the dissemination of disinformation. And I think that dovetails into censorship, because how do you stop that without some kind of censorship? Or, I don't know.
I think they're exactly right. I mean, and as much as, again, like I'm going to try to, I agree with what Twitter did. I do think that they put themselves in that corner, basically. Basically, like, and I'm kind of appalled, is that the word? That Facebook is not following the same strategies. Like, they're actually the one way most people here in the US get their information at this point. It's like all local social news has been dying for a bunch of years. There was actually somebody tweeted the cover of, I think it's the Minneapolis Tribune or whatever, the day after the first kind of riots, and the title was completely unrelated. And somebody say, hey, you know what? It's because they don't have money, so it's basically just a bunch of ads now, and they don't care about reporting news. And I think it's the same challenge. Like Facebook is now in a position where that's how we inform ourselves, and so it's their job to actually make sure that the right information and the right information is in itself problematic. But some information gets verified and fact-checked, and by kind of refusing that role that they actually have because they took over that position, I think they're playing a very, very dangerous game.
This is great. I think we've got censorship, we've got politics, we've got social media, we've got user-controlled data. I think we hit on all the sort of hot button, juicy issues. So I appreciate everybody going there. I thought maybe it would be time. Sorry?
Go ahead. I want to make it a bit more controversial, maybe around one thing. I don't know if that makes sense, but like,
go for it.
Data for me is a very interesting beast. So I've been again like doing this open web stuff forever, and you might have seen this like the different version of a decentralized web, right? There's one which is completely peer-to-peer, and the other approach is like federation, where basically everybody talks to, like, email is federated in that way, and say Bitcoin is peer-to-peer in that model, or BitTorrent is peer-to-peer. Data for me is, I mean, and it's even going back older, it's kind of, I don't think we can meaningfully decouple data from the software that actually exploits that data. Let me explain what I mean. Like, yes, there's some stuff that's, I mean, my name, first name, last name, cool, that's very specific, like that's, yes, that can be decoupled. But there's a ton of things that in the end is so specific that it's really, really hard to actually make it decentralized, in the sense that the data and the software that actually exploits or runs that data are completely decoupled, which means that somebody can come with a fork of the same software or a different software rather, and exploits the same data without creating kind of nightmares and conflicts and kind of limiting the ability of each of these applications to run. In some way, I mean, and I don't know if you agree with this, but like, I used to be exactly on your side, like, no, open data. And when Facebook actually in 2009 or 10 started allowing people to export their data, it was just, oh, okay, download this massive HTML file, which is basically all of the stuff that you've ever posted on Facebook. And to me, like, that was kind of the final blow. Like, yeah, I mean, I got my data, can't do anything with it. and so it's kind of like, that's the tension that I have around the idea of data. And again, like, you mentioned the genocide, it's a completely different topic. I mean, in my mind, yes, there's data, it's information more than data. And for me, data, it's kind of too dumb, with a lot of air quotes, to be something that can be extracted from the software that actually runs or creates it in some ways.
Well, maybe this gets at a core question of like what the decentralized web is, like from earlier. Does, like, Alex and Andrew, do you all agree, for example, do you all think that user control of data is a critical component of a future decentralized web, for example, and data portability? This is a concept that's talked about sometimes. It sounds like maybe that's what you're sort of skeptical of, Julian. I'm putting words in your mouth.
I'm kind of playing devil's advocate for myself here.
I think it also kind of brushes over a lot of nuance there. Like you yourself pointed out, email. Email is a great case of interoperable data where I can easily move to another service and still use email the exact same way. So yeah, I think the main.
But email is a good point in the sense that email hasn't evolved in 20 plus years, and to a lot of people, the fact that we have so much spam that it's actually a very crappy tool. If you think about this, like the fact that we have the emergence of like Slack and all of the messaging platform in the professional environment, but also in the private environment, is also kind of a failure of email in practice. Because email was supposed to be messaging, right?
Yeah. I think the thing that I tend to focus on in my thinking a lot is actually what is the reward of a company from collecting my data? And today, the network is set up such that data network effects are real. Collecting my data and getting value from it is real. And so it's created sort of this race in the market for companies to collect as much data about me as possible. And oftentimes that data that they're collecting may not even have a direct value today, but they know that it will possibly unlock value year, 5 years from now. And so they create very large databases about my data. And on top of that, data has a very interesting property in today's market and network of companies in that it has gravity. And so when you start collecting a lot of data, you can start the flywheel of value that data creates at your company. And if you build a big enough flywheel, other data is going to be valuable enough for you to go and acquire that data, which means suck up other companies that are collecting interesting and valuable data sets. And so what we've seen in Silicon Valley in particular is sort of a collection of companies start coming together and merging to the top until you're left with a handful of companies that have massive data sets about individuals that cover our entire behavior set. And to me, that's really problematic. And so thinking about ways that we can solve it through interoperability, through greater protocols for encryption, through ownership and access and visibility are all really interesting topics. And I don't think we have a solution today that says, oh, let's just deliver this thing. It's going to make all them come toppling down. But I think it's really valuable that we explore and sort of research and try to figure out what are those entry points that we can cross those moats and we can bring that data back to the people.
Well, I think there are some good ideas out there that that we've all probably seen for different data markets and ways that, because something you didn't mention is ways that you could actually share in the value that's generated from the collection of this data. Ownership implies that you would have some value that you could gain from the ownership of that data, and I think there's some really cool ideas out there for that. Julian, what you were talking about some data that you didn't think could be
let me give you
disintermediated or decentralized. Can you think about what that is?
And again, like, I'm playing devil's advocate, so don't hold too many grudges against me. Like, I'm myself sure what's the right way. But like, let's talk about Google. Google is probably by far one of the companies that has the most data on me. And in practice, a lot of it's actually useful for me because they actually provide me good search results when I'm actually doing a search. I love DuckDuckGo. I think it's the only viable alternative. But basically, it's still not nearly as good as Google. Like, I actually type often the shortcut with question mark and that redirects you to Google. I use that a lot. And so in some way, I'm thinking like, okay, Google is extremely powerful because they've got so much information about me, but also because they've got so much information about us collectively. In a world where there would be, as you said, like this network effect, a world where there would be kind of two search engines that are as powerful, basically two equally, I would assume, based on the fact that there's network effect, that the actual quality of search results would be worse than half of what it is with Google. And to me, that kind of raises the question of like, do I really want Google to be weaker? Because again, like, putting aside a bunch of things, I want a very, very good search engine. And the best search engine will always be the one that has the most information about me and the most information about the most people, basically. So in some way, it needs to be, again, monopolistic in many ways. It needs to be the largest with a massive market share and kind of know everything about me to provide me the best results. And so in that world, kind of decoupling or sharing the data, I'm not sure would actually work. And so for me, going back to kind of the decentralized web in that world is not so much one where Google is weaker, but one where governance or control of Google itself is a lot more transparent, at least, and a lot more distributed in itself. Like, basically, it's not, and maybe Google is not the worst example here, but Facebook, I mean, it's not really same. A social network with only half of the world people in the world is kind of a failure. Like, the point of a social network is to have everyone, right?
I think that's an interesting idea. Certainly, I think that.
Think about Bitcoin, like, every time there's a fork of Bitcoin, basically it makes the whole idea of, I mean, if two forks succeed, in some way it makes that money kind of weaker, because we end up in a world like, no, there's actually two competing things, which is worse than having one thing that actually does it very, very well. And in that world, basically, it's not so much about the data itself, than it is about the governance that's created. And so maybe Bitcoin's governance in that way, which is non-governance in some way, but at least it's not like nobody can take it over, which is the non-governance push to the extreme, is interesting in that world. And yeah,
but that, you just said that competition is bad for the products that you get.
I don't say competition. It's basically split of value, which is not competition. Like, competition would be good. I mean, I want a world in which there's a way to fork Bitcoin, but I don't want two forks to succeed in some way. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. I think that things could end up that way, but I think it's too early to tell still. I think part of the reason why you haven't had a decentralized competitor to some of these other businesses that you mentioned, like Google, for example, pop up is because the technology, the user interface, the things that need to be in place to actually make that succeed aren't quite there yet from a true decentralization standpoint. I mean, I think,
yeah, but there's also,
from a scalability and all that.
There's also, in what you were just saying, again, it sort of just brushes over a lot of the nuance, because I agree with you totally that the service that Google gives me is really good. I mean, there's very few things I use as frequently in technology. Yeah. And in fact, I think we were talking about about some things we might talk about today. And one of the ideas that came to my mind is what we really need in the Web3 space is actually a product that has the utility value of Google Maps. You know, something that you go to on that frequency and is embedded that much in your life. And so I totally agree with you at the value there. But at the same time, we have to wonder, you know, what are the actual costs that are coming with that value? And we know that they exist. So I haven't read a lot about the, you know, censorship and manipulation in Google search results, but Tristan Harris has some really great writing and some podcasts about these topics, and like the idea of YouTube, how tuned it's become to your preferences so that it can optimize for you to watch just 30 seconds of a video and drill down into very edge sort of ideas if you keep following that. Is that the product you want? And I think maybe the product you want would be benefited by having a more competitive space.
So what I want here, I mean, that's the YouTube example is perfect. You're exactly right. Like in these stories, it's basically correct me if I'm misphrasing it, but I think the big challenge was like YouTube had a goal of reaching 1 billion hours of content viewed per day around the world. And if you think about this is an insane goal. Like we're 7 billion roughly. So it means basically 1 in 7 of us is spending 1 hour a day on YouTube, which is insane. And yet they reached it. They reached it about 2 years ago at this point. And the way they reached it, exactly what you said, they reached it by basically optimizing for attention grabbing. And so it's like, all right, cool. You're watching 22 minutes. Let's get you to watch 33 minutes. And the kind of content that people look at, I mean, that's how our lizard brain is built, is kind of the accident on the side of the road, the controversial thing, the thing that creates engagement, the thing that kind of makes us upset, that makes us sad, that makes us happy sometimes, but the kind of thing that is not necessarily making us smarter. And that's exactly what happened here. So in the context of YouTube, what I would optimize for is not so much like 5 different YouTubes where like they all have different types of content, which is kind of hard, but it's like a better incentive mechanism. It's like, that's kind of the check and balance that I would love to see. Is like, no, it's not right for that platform that gets basically a plug into my brain to kind of show me stuff and help me think. It's not right that they optimize for a metric, which is basically the amount of minutes that I'm going to spend there. This is
Julian, I agree with you. I think I agree with everything you're saying, but I think though that it's going to be a lot longer road to have YouTube and Google to do that than some competitor who builds a better system, you know, that is governed in the right way to achieve what you're talking about. Like I think a competitor has, and whether it's built on decentralized technology or not, right? A competitor has to come by, and then the users actually have to care.
I mean,
that they like, we all see the problem, but just like the majority of, you know, the users of YouTube actually see the problem that we're discussing right now. I think that there's a lot there, and it goes back to the nuances of what's kind of involved in making it successful or not.
So I'm as much as I would love the competitor to, and sorry, I'm maybe speaking too much. So go ahead, Brad.
Well, there is a case where users are aware of this and are talking about this right now on YouTube, and it's crypto people getting taken down.
Yeah.
And the crypto people are basically saying, okay, my videos are getting taken down. YouTube is taking this role of being my data storage provider as well as the place where I go and find content. Is there a way for me to pull out the data storage providing piece away from YouTube because they're abusing their authority? Power. And so like that's one issue that's coming out. Like how do you all think about that?
No, I think that's right.
Yeah, I mean, it's exactly the thing we're talking about. That's troublesome.
But to me, I mean, the way this works, and we can go back again in history, but like, it's not so much a competitor emerges. It's like YouTube becomes irrelevant. Like, if you think about like what we're talking about is like antitrust, and it's something that's been happening for like 50 years on community. I mean, software is by definition something that gets centralized very quickly. Like IBM was like arch dominant, and it became irrelevant when eventually Windows and Microsoft kind of came out and say, hey, you know what, we're completely changing the paradigm from like this mainframe thing to the PC stuff. Then 20 years later, Microsoft was arch dominant. Basically, everybody. I was on a Mac, so I remember that pretty painfully. But like everybody was just using PCs everywhere, and like the Apple market share was going from 5 to 43 to I think less than 3% at some point. The only thing that made Microsoft irrelevant is basically the emergence of the web. It's like a new paradigm emerges, and then Google becomes the arch-dominant thing, and it's still extremely relevant, obviously, but it's less and less relevant because Facebook emerged, and because maybe Amazon emerged as well. And so it's not so much like competition never is something that comes and kind of replaces the old thing. It something emerges that makes the old stuff irrelevant. And that's actually what I'm hopeful about crypto, because I feel like we're in this kind of 20-year cycle of like, hey, there's been a new pattern. And for me, like even though the web is like 30 years old, kind of the dominance of the web. Google is actually 22, I think, at this point, right? This kind of 20-year time frame, like IBM 20 years, Windows like from the 80s to 2000, Windows era 20 years. The Google / Amazon / Facebook era is right now, and to me that's one of the hopes that I have around crypto as an ecosystem. It's like it starts to bring the emergence of a new paradigm that actually kind of reshuffles the cards, and we'll see the emergence of an archie dominant platform, which hopefully this time is built around better governance and better redistribution of power.
Well, it's interesting. You brought up Microsoft and Google and the different wave, and then Facebook, that transition. And I would argue that none of those companies are irrelevant today. I think nor did they get replaced, right? Like I don't know what market cap is today, but it's pretty big. And Microsoft is a $1.4 trillion business. But they all exist. And what I would argue is that there's going to be alongside, like in the Web3 space, same. I agree with you that it will be alongside them. But these other things will continue to grow in value.
But you go from a place where Microsoft was the largest by far, and nothing was actually nearly close, to like Microsoft is just one of five, which is. I mean, irrelevant means big word. Even though it is irrelevant for a lot of people on the web. Like I actually don't use any.
I don't think that's true anymore. They've been really smart about buying LinkedIn.
On the GitHub stuff. Yeah, I know.
They're back. But yeah, I agree with all your points at some level, and even the idea of governance and all these things as being a solution to this. I think we need to attack it from multiple angles. So I think they're complementary in a lot of ways, and trying to discover the new ways that developers can build these future alternatives, I think, is super important, and we'll figure it out.
And and I know we're getting close to time, so I thought maybe if we can just sort of try to wrap up around a question of specific predictions next 5 years. What do you think is going to be working inside of the D-Web that does not currently work right now?
I'll go first because I spoke too much, and I'll go very quickly. I think governance. That's the thing that I'm actually very hopeful will be much better soon. And whether it's the emergence of cooperatives, basically a new way to manage commons is what I'm excited about.
You want to go, Andrew?
Sure. Yeah. I think back to my kind of trying to be pragmatic here. The idea, I think, no matter what happens in the next 5 years, we have to lower this time to failure KPI. We need to make it so that all of these protocols and technologies are the place that people come to experiment and try their new ideas first. So that they can see if things work and see how things exist, so that then the next step of their process, they actually continue to build on them. And I think through that, we'll get to that point of building applications that have the utility factor of Google Maps. And if we don't have a few of those in 5 years, then I think it'll be a shame.
Yeah. I was going to say the utility piece via good user experience, which is, I think, a very similar thing to what you were just saying, Andrew. I really hope that we have applications that are super easy to use for general consumer. They don't need any crypto knowledge to get in there and do what they need to get done. Also, I'm really interested in zero knowledge proofs. I'm not a technical person, but I really hope that technology gets figured out. I think it's pretty important. For privacy reasons, but who knows? There's a lot of legwork to be done there. So those are two things that I'd love to see.
It's exciting. All right, so I think we are out of time here. Thank you all so much. I know this was probably a different direction than a lot of these panels have gone for.
That was really fun.
Hopefully it was.
Yeah, it was good.
Hopefully it was fun for everybody. Also, I recommend you just put into the chat, just put a link to wherever you want folks to find more about the company, whether it's social media, whatever, as well as your name, just so everybody can find it later.
Thank you, everyone.
All right, I'll do that now.
Thanks, everyone.
And thanks, Brad, for managing.
Thanks, everybody.
This.
Yeah, thank you.